We arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The dirt road leading up to it was narrow, hemmed in by dense trees that leaned toward us like they'd been waiting. The lake wasn't visible until we parked, but when we saw it, the sight took our breath away. It was massive, surrounded by thick forest, and the water shimmered with an unnatural stillness, reflecting the fading orange of the sunset. Jules had found the place. She always prided herself on digging up rentals that felt like secrets, and this one was no exception. "You won't believe how cheap it was," she'd said a week earlier, shoving her phone screen in my face. The photos had shown a rustic little cabin perched at the water's edge, the perfect spot for a weekend getaway. Now, standing in its shadow, the cabin felt smaller than it had in the pictures. The wood siding was weathered, the windows slightly fogged, but it had a charm to it. Cozy, Jules had called it. I wasn't so sure. Something about the place and the lake felt heavy, like the air itself was thicker out here. "This is perfect," Paige said, breaking the silence. She stood with her hands on her hips, grinning at the lake. "Good call, Jules." "See," Jules said, grabbing her bag from the trunk. "You guys never trust me, but I always come through." Dylan snorted as he hoisted the cooler out of the car. "If this place has decent plumbing, I'll consider it a win." We spent the first evening settling in, unpacking and exploring the cabin. The living room was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The kitchen smelled faintly of damp wood, and the narrow staircase creaked under our weight as we carried our bags upstairs. The back deck, though, was the star of the show. It stretched out over the lake, giving us an unobstructed view of the water, which was now turning a deep, glassy black under the darkening sky. As night fell, we built a fire in the pit near the water and sat in a loose circle, passing beers back and forth. The conversation was easy at first, the kind of reminiscing and teasing we always fell into when we were together. But as the night wore on, a strange quiet settled over us. The crackling of the fire seemed too loud, the laughter forced. Even Dylan, who usually filled every silence with some obnoxious joke, seemed subdued. "It's the lake," Jules said suddenly, her voice soft. She was staring out at the water, her beer dangling loosely from her fingers. "What about it?" Paige asked. "It's weird, isn't it? The way it doesn't move." We all looked. She was right. The lake was eerily still, not even a ripple disturbing its surface. It should have been beautiful, but in the flickering firelight it looked wrong. Too perfect, like it was trying to convince us of something. "It's a lake," Dylan said, rolling his eyes. "That's what lakes do. They sit there." "I'm serious," Jules said, her tone sharper now. "It doesn't feel right." "Are you scared of the water?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. She shook her head. "Not scared. Just, I don't know, it feels like it's watching." "Okay, creepy," Paige said, laughing nervously. "Thanks for that." We changed the subject after that, but the strange mood lingered. One by one we drifted off to bed, until only Jules and I were left by the fire. She was staring at the lake again, her brow furrowed. "Are you okay?" I asked. She hesitated, then shrugged. "It's probably nothing, just my imagination." But she didn't sound convinced. I went to bed a little after midnight, leaving Jules still sitting by the fire. I woke once during the night, startled by what I thought was a splash outside, but when I listened closer, I didn't hear anything. The sound could have been part of a dream. At least that's what I told myself as I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, Jules wasn't in her bed. Her shoes were gone, and so was her jacket, but she hadn't left a note or mentioned going anywhere. At first, I wasn't too worried. She was an early riser, always itching to explore. But when she didn't come back by the time we'd finished breakfast, concern started to creep in. We checked the woods first, calling her name and following the narrow trails that wound through the trees. Then we searched the cabin, even places she'd have no reason to be, like the tiny crawl space under the porch. Nothing. It wasn't until Dylan wandered down to the lake that we found a clue. "Guys," he called, his voice tense. "You need to see this." Paige and I hurried over, finding him standing at the edge of the water. He pointed to the ground, and my stomach turned when I saw what he was looking at. Footprints pressed deep into the damp mud, leading straight into the lake. But there were no prints coming back. "Are you sure these are hers?" Paige asked, though we all knew the answer. "Who else would they belong to?" Dylan snapped. "This doesn't make any sense. Why would she go in the water?" "She wouldn't," I said, but the words felt hollow. I couldn't stop staring at the lake, its surface calm and unbroken. It seemed to mock us, daring us to find an explanation. "She probably went for a swim," Dylan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "She'll show up. I mean, it's not like she just disappeared." We waited all day, but Jules didn't come back. By evening, we were panicking. Paige called the police, but they said it would take hours for anyone to reach us, and when we tried to drive into town, the car wouldn't start. It was as if the lake wanted us to stay. That night, as we sat on the deck, too tense to sleep, I thought I saw something. A flicker of movement on the lake. "There," I said, pointing. "Did you see that?" Paige leaned forward, squinting at the water. "See what?" "I don't know." I thought I trailed off. The lake was still again, the surface undisturbed. "You're freaking yourself out," Dylan said, though his eyes lingered on the water a little too long. But I wasn't imagining it. I knew what I'd seen. A head barely breaking the surface, watching us, waiting. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. That night, sleep was impossible. The cabin felt suffocating, the air too still, the walls too close. Every creak of the old wood set my nerves on edge, and every sound outside made me tense. The others were restless too. I could hear Dylan pacing in the living room and Paige whispering to herself, her voice trembling. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken me because I woke to the faint sound of footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel path near the cabin. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps paused, then started again, this time moving closer. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see. The moon cast long, silver shadows across the deck, and for a moment I thought the space was empty. But then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the deck, facing the lake. It was Jules. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. She was barefoot, her hair hanging limp and wet around her face. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her skin, and her head was tilted forward as if she was listening to something only she could hear. "Jules," I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't move. I hurried to the living room, where Paige and Dylan were sitting. Paige was wrapped in a blanket, her face pale and drawn, while Dylan stood by the fire, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "She's outside," I said, my voice sharp with urgency. "Jules is outside." Dylan's head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" "She's on the deck," I said, already heading for the door. I saw her. Paige jumped up, the blanket falling to the floor. "Oh my God," she said, her voice shaking. "She's back." "Wait," Dylan said, grabbing my arm before I could open the door. "What if it's not her?" "What are you talking about?" Paige demanded, her voice rising. "Of course it's her." "You didn't see what we saw earlier," Dylan said, his eyes darting to the window. "The lake isn't right. What if? What if it's not her?" Paige ignored him, pushing past to reach the door. I hesitated, doubt gnawing at me, but when I glanced back at the window, Jules was still there. She looked cold and lost, and the sight of her made my chest ache. Paige yanked the door open, stepping onto the deck. "Jules," she called, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" Jules turned slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her face was pale, her lips blue, and her eyes were wrong. They were darker than they should have been, like twin pits of ink that reflected nothing back. "Paige," I whispered, grabbing her arm. "Don't go any closer." But Paige was already moving, stepping toward Jules with hesitant, trembling steps. "Jules," she said again, "we've been looking for you. Are you okay?" Jules tilted her head, her lips twitching into a smile that stretched too wide. "It's so peaceful," she said, her voice soft and lilting, like it was coming from far away. "You should come see." Paige froze, her breath hitching. "What do you mean?" "The lake," Jules said, gesturing to the water behind her. "It's beautiful. It's waiting for you." Dylan grabbed Paige's arm, pulling her back. "That's not her," he hissed. "Look at her. That's not Jules." Jules's smile faltered, and her head tilted even further, almost unnaturally. "Don't you trust me?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock hurt. "It's so cold out here. Let me in." Paige tried to wrench free, but Dylan held her firm. "No," he said, his voice steady. "You're not coming inside." Jules's smile disappeared completely. Her face twisted into something grotesque, her eyes narrowing and her lips pulling back to reveal teeth that seemed sharper than they should have been. "You can't keep me out," she said, her voice deepening, layered with something inhuman. The temperature seemed to drop instantly, a biting cold seeping into the air. The lake behind her began to ripple, its surface churning violently despite the stillness of the night. Shapes started to rise from the water pail, gaunt figures that moved with a jerking, unnatural rhythm. Their eyes were as black as Jules's, their skin slick and glistening. "Run," Dylan shouted, slamming the door shut and locking it. The three of us stumbled back into the living room, the sound of wet footsteps and muffled knocks following us. The windows rattled as the figures outside pressed against them, their faces pale and distorted, their eyes fixed on us. "What do we do?" Paige cried, clutching her head. "We can't just stay here." "We don't go outside," Dylan said firmly, grabbing the fire poker from the hearth. "That's what we don't do." The knocking stopped suddenly, plunging the cabin into silence. For a moment none of us moved, our breaths shallow and ragged. Then, slowly, the door handle began to turn. The door handle twisted with an agonizing slowness, the soft creak of metal grating against silence. All three of us froze, staring as the handle moved back and forth, testing the lock. It wasn't forceful, it was deliberate, almost playful, like someone who knew they had all the time in the world. "Don't open it," Dylan whispered, clutching the fire poker so tightly his knuckles turned white. His voice was steady, but I could see the tremor in his hands. "I wasn't planning on it," I hissed back, trying to keep my voice low. Paige whimpered, clutching her knees to her chest as she sat on the couch. Tears streaked her face, and she was muttering under her breath, the same words over and over. "It's not her. It's not her. It's not her." The handle stopped moving, and for a moment everything went silent. Then came the knock, soft at first, almost polite. The sound made my stomach churn, each tap measured and deliberate, like it knew how much time we had left to feel safe. Knock, knock, knock. "Let me in," the voice came from the other side of the door. It was Jules, or at least it sounded like her, but her tone was flat, lifeless, without the warmth we knew. "It's so cold out here. I'm freezing." "No," Dylan whispered again, standing between us and the door. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of scraping. Something hard dragged against the wood, a low, guttural screech that made the hair on my arm stand on end. It wasn't just at the door anymore. The sound moved, traveling along the wall, then to the windows, as if the thing or things outside was circling the cabin. "They're trying to find a way in," Paige said, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, they're going to get in." "No, they won't," Dylan snapped. "We just have to hold out." "For how long?" I asked. My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't help it. "Until the sun comes up. Until they get bored." "I don't know," Dylan snapped. "I just know we're not opening that damn door." The scraping sound stopped abruptly, plunging us into a silence that was somehow worse. I strained to listen, my ears searching for any hint of movement, but the world outside had gone eerily still. And then we heard it. Footsteps, wet, slapping footsteps, moving toward the back of the cabin. They weren't alone either. There were more of them now, coming from every direction, circling us like predators. "They're at the back door," I whispered. Dylan nodded, backing up slowly, his eyes darting around the room. "Barricade it," he said. Grab anything you can." We scrambled to pile furniture in front of the back door, dragging the kitchen table and chairs into a makeshift blockade. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right on the other side of the wall. Thud. The first impact made the doorframe tremble. Paige screamed, clutching my arm as another thud rattled the cabin. Dylan stood with the fire poker raised, his face pale but set with grim determination. "Stay back," he warned, though none of us moved closer. The door didn't break right away. Whatever was on the other side wasn't trying to force its way in with brute strength. It was calculated, testing the weak spots, waiting for us to panic. Each thud was deliberate, spaced just far enough apart to let the tension build. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. Finally, the banging stopped. "Did they give up?" Paige asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dylan shook his head. "I don't think they." The window shattered. Glass sprayed into the room as a pale, wet hand reached through, its fingers too long and jointed at odd angles. Paige screamed, scrambling backward as the hand groped for something to grab. Dylan reacted first, swinging the fire poker with all his strength. The metal connected with a sickening crunch, and the hand recoiled, leaving a trail of dark, viscous fluid on the broken glass. But it didn't stop. Another hand reached in, followed by another, and then a face appeared at the window. It was Jules, or the thing that had been wearing her face. Its features were stretched and distorted, the eyes too large and black, the mouth curling into a smile that was all wrong. "You can't keep us out," it said, its voice echoing strangely, as if it were coming from the bottom of the lake. "We're already inside." As the words sank in, the lights in the cabin flickered, then went out completely. Total darkness enveloped us, broken only by the faint, pale glow of the moon filtering through the shattered window. I could hear Paige sobbing, Dylan cursing under his breath, and the wet, slapping sounds of feet moving inside. "We have to go," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We can't stay here." "Go where?" Dylan hissed. "They're everywhere." "Out the front," I said. "We make a run for the car." "It's not going to stop," Paige said, her voice raw with fear. "We tried earlier. It's dead." "Then we run into the woods," I said. "We can't stay here. If we stay, we're—" A loud crash cut me off as the barricade at the back door gave way. I didn't wait to see what came through. Grabbing Paige's hand, I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running blindly into the night. Dylan was right behind us, his breathing ragged. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I could hear them behind us, the sound of wet feet and guttural whispers, growing louder with every step. The lake glimmered in my peripheral vision, its surface churning like it was alive. The forest loomed ahead, dark and endless. Without thinking, I plunged into the trees, the branches tearing at my skin as I ran. Paige stumbled behind me, crying out as she tripped over a root, but I hauled her to her feet and kept going. Dylan's flashlight bobbed wildly as he followed, the beam cutting erratically through the darkness. "They're still coming," Paige screamed, looking back over her shoulder. "Don't look back," I shouted. "Just keep running." The whispers were closer now, almost in my ear. They were speaking words I couldn't understand, but the sound made my head ache, like they were burrowing into my brain. Up ahead, I saw a faint glow moonlight breaking through the trees. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I pushed forward, desperate to reach the clearing. When we broke through the tree line, I skidded to a halt, my heart sinking. We were back at the lake. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We hadn't escaped at all. We'd been running in circles, drawn back to the lake like it was pulling us in. The water shimmered under the moonlight, its surface deceptively calm now, as though it had been waiting for us to return. "No," Paige whimpered, clutching my arm. No, we didn't come this way. We didn't." Dylan stood behind us, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. His flashlight beam wavered across the trees, the ground, and finally the lake, as if searching for some escape route we'd missed. But there was none. "Why are we back here?" he hissed. "We went the other direction. We." A sound interrupted him. A low, resonant hum that seemed to rise from the lake itself, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. It was deep and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, and it made my skin crawl. "Do you hear that?" Paige whispered, her voice trembling. "What is that?" Before I could answer, the surface of the lake began to ripple. At first it was subtle, like the wind was brushing against it. But then the ripples grew stronger, more violent, until the water seemed to boil, churning and frothing with unnatural energy. Shapes began to rise from the depths. Pale figures, their limbs too long and their bodies too thin, emerged one by one. Their faces were blank, their eyes black and bottomless. Water streamed from their hair and skin, pooling around their feet as they moved onto the shore with a jerking, unnatural rhythm. "Oh my God," Paige sobbed, backing away. "What are they? What do they want?" Dylan gripped the fire poker tighter, though it looked laughably inadequate against the sheer number of them. "They want us," he said grimly. "They've been waiting." The figures moved closer, their heads tilting unnaturally as they watched us. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It was smaller than the others, and as it drew closer, I recognized it. It was Jules, or at least it looked like her. "Stop," I said, my voice cracking. "Don't come any closer." She or it ignored me, taking another step forward. Her skin was pale and slick, her hair clinging to her face like seaweed. But her eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too empty, and they locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "You should have stayed," she said, her voice soft and distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "It's better down there. Peaceful." Jules, Paige sobbed, stepping toward her. "Is it really you? Are you alive?" "Paige," "No," Dylan shouted, grabbing her arm. "That's not her." But Paige ignored him, pulling free and moving closer to Jules. Her tears glistened in the moonlight, her face a mask of desperation. "Jules, please," she said. "We can help you. We can." Jules smiled, and it was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. Her lips stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were jagged and wrong, as if they'd been reshaped for something other than eating. Her head tilted, and she held out her hand. "Come see," she said. "You'll love it." Paige hesitated, her hand hovering inches from Jules's outstretched fingers. Dylan and I both lunged forward at the same time, grabbing her and yanking her back just as Jules's hand shot forward. Her fingers missed Paige by a fraction of an inch, and for a split second her expression twisted into something feral and angry. Then she lunged. Dylan swung the fire poker with everything he had, the metal connecting with a sickening crunch against Jules's shoulder. She stumbled back, but she didn't fall. Instead, she straightened, her head snapping back into place with a sound like cracking bone. Her black eyes locked onto Dylan, and her smile widened. The other figures began to move, closing in from all sides. Their jerky, unnatural movements made my stomach churn, and their low, guttural whispers filled the air, blending with the hum that still emanated from the lake. "We have to run," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." Where? Dylan shouted. "They're everywhere." I scanned the shoreline desperately, looking for anything that could offer an escape. Then I saw a small rowboat tied to a rickety wooden dock a few yards away. It looked ancient, its paint peeling and its edges warped, but it was our only option. "There," I said, pointing. "The boat." Dylan grabbed Paige, who was sobbing uncontrollably, and we sprinted toward the dock. The figures followed, their movements quicker now, more purposeful. The sound of their wet feet slapping against the ground was sickening, but I forced myself to keep moving. When we reached the boat, Dylan shoved Paige in first, then turned to me. "Go," he shouted. I climbed in, grabbing one of the oars, and Dylan pushed the boat off the dock before jumping in himself. The figures reached the edge of the water just as we drifted out of reach. They stopped, their heads tilting as they watched us. For a moment I thought we were safe. Then the water began to churn again. "They're coming," Dylan said, his voice tight with panic. "Row, row." I plunged the oar into the water, paddling with every ounce of strength I had. Dylan grabbed the other oar, and together we fought against the current, which seemed to be pulling us back toward the center of the lake. Behind us, the figures stepped into the water. They didn't swim, they walked, their movements slow but steady, as if the lake itself was carrying them forward. "We're not going to make it," Paige sobbed, her voice barely audible over the sound of the water. "Yes, we are," Dylan shouted, his voice filled with desperate determination. "Keep rowing." The boat creaked and groaned as we pushed forward, the ancient wood threatening to splinter under the strain. The figures were closer now, their black eyes fixed on us. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air and making my vision blur. Then, something rose from the water in front of us. It was massive, its body shrouded in shadow, and its presence was suffocating. It had no eyes, no discernible face, but its form radiated malice. The water beneath it boiled and churned, and as it loomed over us, I realized the truth. The lake itself was alive. It opened, a dark, yawning void that stretched impossibly wide, and we were being pulled straight into it. The boat tilted violently, the oars slipping from my hands as the current dragged us closer. Paige screamed, clutching the sides of the boat, and Dylan swung the fire poker uselessly at the air. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed us was Jules's face, smiling from the water, her black eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Then the lake closed over my head, and everything went silent. It didn't let us go. It never would.